Hey, everybody. I hope you're having a good day. I have someone really cool with me today. This is actually my first time doing a YouTube interview like this, but we have today Greta Aurora, and a number of you probably know her from the really cool videos that she's been putting out for a bit now. She talks about Me Too and philosophy and the relationship between the sexes and anyways, some really interesting stuff. And if you don't know me, I'm Colonel Kurtz, and I like to make videos about celebrity controversies and pop culture controversies and things like that. I want to introduce Greta, and then we're going to talk a bit about how we got here. So, hey, Greta, how are you doing?
Hi, it's so nice talking to you. I've been really enjoying your videos.
Thank you. Thank you. I've been really enjoying yours too. And it's so funny because I think it was maybe like 4 days ago when someone on Twitter who follows both of us, she posted that we were her two favorite YouTubers now. And so I was really happy to hear that because she'll be getting a nice surprise. Anyway, so like I was telling everybody, we only discovered each other's channels like what, about 3 weeks ago, right? and
Yes.
and actually this happened by way of the Marilyn Manson controversy. And so for, I think probably both sets of our viewers are aware of this, but I started making videos on this topic a few weeks ago because I had real problems with the media narrative surrounding these allegations, and I had a number of problems with the allegations themselves and with the rush to judgment that I thought was taking place. And so I made a video about it. And then I noticed that you had made a video even before me, and that you talked a bit about a brief relationship that you had with Marilyn Manson. So you want to tell us a little bit about like how you started making videos, or why you wanted to make the video about Marilyn Manson?
So I started my YouTube channel nearly a year ago now. And my original goal was to celebrate the differences between men and women. I have a background in biology, although my main interests have always been the arts. And I'm also very interested in psychology, human behavior. And I have always been very critical of feminism, especially the MeToo movement. So I gradually started to talk more and more about feminism, making fun of feminism, but I'm also trying to have a more positive message. And that was kind of the idea behind the Marilyn Manson video I did too. So on the one hand, I wanted to share my personal experience, but I also feel very strongly about the way our culture views women, especially with regards to their responsibility and agency in relationships, both in personal and professional relationships. So I wanted to share what I consider to be a positive message for both men and women, encouraging them to view each other as competent adults, and especially encouraging women to view themselves as complete human beings who are perfectly capable of accounting for their own actions. And I realized it back then, and I realized it even more since I made that video, that there's a very, very thin line between victim blaming and pointing out certain contradictions in feminist thinking about the role of women and the events of their lives.
That's a really good point that well, a number of good points. And I know we had some things that we talked about discussing, but you mentioned something there about the line between the fine line between victim blaming and just right and just analyzing the facts of the situation or making a logical argument about someone's credibility. I think that, I know that in the past, the pendulum had swung too far the other way, where women, their sexual histories were cross-examined in courts and things like that. But I do feel like it's gotten to the point now, where if you ask legitimate questions about an accuser's credibility, or you notice problems, you point out problems in their story, that it's seen as victim blaming. I don't know. Do you have any more thoughts about that, or how you think of that or negotiate that?
This idea that we should believe all women and always believe them. You know, if there's ever been a toxic idea, it's definitely it. And I'm not a fan of the word toxic, especially in relation to masculinity. But
Yeah.
it is a really pervasive idea in culture these days. And no, I don't think we should always believe women. It's actually infantilizing to assume that women don't lie. And that's kind of a throwback to centuries and centuries of what feminists like to call women's oppression, which, by the way, I don't agree with. I don't see history as one long story of one sex being oppressed by the other. I just think I like to look at history in a more nuanced way. But what feminists interpret as women's oppression is basically taking away all rights and therefore all responsibilities from women.
Mm-hmm.
This is what they used to call coverture in the English speaking world. There was this term femme covert. Mm-hmm. Basically meant that the male relatives, and it's still like this in a lot of patriarchal societies in the world, but the male relatives of a woman are responsible for all her actions. So if a woman commits a crime, it's her father or her husband who has to pay for that crime. And a lot of what these MeToo feminists seem to be yearning for is kind of what the early feminists were fighting against, you know, so passionately.
Yes, I think that we've talked about this a bit before on our channels. You cannot in this world, you cannot have absolute 100% freedom and absolute 100% safety all the time, because these two, at least in our world, they are in tension with each other. And so it's exactly what you're saying there about rights and responsibilities, and that modern feminism wants the rights or the freedom, but at the same time doesn't want the responsibilities, or doesn't want to recognize that with freedom, you know, comes responsibility, or that you have to consider your safety at times.
And danger.
Yes, go ahead.
Danger is another big thing that comes with safety, and that's what I really love about Camille Pallia's work.
Yes,
she's good at pointing out these contradictions in feminist thinking. She once said in an interview that when she was at university in the early 60s, there was a strict curfew. Girls had to be back by a certain time, I think by 9 or 10.
In loco parentis, right? That the college was in place of the parent. Yeah, go ahead.
And that only applied for women, so the men could do whatever they wanted to do. And the way she put it is that they wanted the freedom to risk rape.
Yes, yes.
And I think that's very powerful, because the universities were doing their best to protect them from any dangers that might be lurking in the dark and in the big dangerous world outside university. And they wanted to explore that world. They wanted to be able to take responsibility for their own actions. Right. And I think that's what women's liberation, or anyone's liberation, should be about. I mean, liberation means that you will be held accountable for your actions, and you want that freedom to risk it, to take risks. That's a very important freedom, I think.
Right, absolutely. And I think, you know, I don't know why modern feminism is so invested in victimization. And I realize that there's a lot of legitimate sexual assault and domestic violence, but what we're talking about here, this infantilization of women. And I don't, you know, I don't know if that's because this kind of attitude is what's sells and people respond to it. Or I don't know. Why do you think that modern feminism is so invested in this? Because you have not very many voices like the Camille Paglias or the Kate Roifes. Why do you think that is? Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, feminism has a few different strands, or I guess you can label or qualify the different strengths according to different criteria. One thing we spoke about yesterday is the TERFs and the trans activists, but there's just one division of feminism that I find really interesting. Another one would be using Greek mythological references, which I really love.
I see that on your channel. Yeah.
So you have Hera feminism, which is trying to preserve, it's more a conservative structure that they're yearning for and control. So Hera is a goddess that's obsessed with power. That's the most important thing about her. And she uses men to obtain the power she craves. And the other lane of feminism is ruled by Persephone. And Persephone is the victim archetype. And I actually describe her story in two of my videos. One when I talk about female archetypes and the other one about cancel culture. And that's exactly the mentality I see in the way these victim feminists express themselves. And that's also the sort of choice of words you picked up on in your analysis of, for example, Esme Bianco's interview. When you use really passive language, a passive voice, and it's an interesting one for me because in Hungarian, we very rarely use the passive voice in the first person.
Really?
So whenever someone talks like that in English, it always sounds a bit, I can pick up on that. So when someone says things like, I was given, I was taken, I was transported, this was done to me.
Right.
This just all sounds really strange to me. It's like, why use that passive voice as if you were a puppet or a little dry leaf blown around in the wind who has absolutely no control?
Right. There's this there, and I think that's what really bothers me too, is this lack of agency, or this just kind of giving up of one's ability to determine one's course or to act. And like in Evan Rachel Wood's testimony, she that she did before the California Assembly, she talked about, she described herself, and she said that she was taken in by the charms of this man, and she was quickly, I think, overwhelmed. The terminology that she uses, it is like you said, it's like of some, like an object or something, just being, just, you know, if women are really that intellectually weak or psychologically weak, where they are at the mercy of men to this degree, then we've got all kinds of problems.
We don't deserve freedom. And that's actually a big issue. If it turns out that women, the majority of women, are unwilling to even consider what role they might have played in the events of their lives, yeah, we do have a major problem. So what are we going to do about it?
And you know, I know that when you're younger, when you're older, whatever age, but I remember that when you're younger, it is hard to at times to assert what you want or what you don't want, especially it can be in dating or romantic situations. And you know, especially if you're like me, and I grew up in a very traditional household, Baptist household, where my father would quote the Bible and tell my mother to submit and stuff, right? And so it was very, that kind of a situation. And I always hated the idea of the weak-willed woman who can't say no and is just at the mercy of the stronger men. And so but I do understand that it's hard in dating, and that is really, you know, that's one of the things that is, it's growing up. The process of growing up is learning to assert yourself more, and we don't do it, men or women, we don't do it probably enough when we're young. But then to go back years later and retroactively decide, as I think a number of these accusers have done, retroactively decide that that was the other person's fault. And that's where the shirking of responsibility comes in. And, you know, one more thing, you've probably heard this before, but there was a study that was done several years ago. They were trying to determine the best way to prevent rape and what they could do to help women prevent rape in these situations that they get into. And anyway, the conclusion of the study was that the most effective thing that we can do is teach women how to say no assertively. And because, you know, that's a number of these situations that happen, like especially on college campuses, when there's been a lot of alcohol consumed, and people are already they don't already have much willpower, and then you throw in sort of female passivity or female non-communication, and then you get these murky situations where the woman comes out of it feeling like she was violated. And anyway, so those are some.
And of course, there are situations where you can't say no, and that's a comment. That's a very common comment I get under that video.
And what do you mean by that? Do you mean like like too drunk, like incapacitated, or what do you mean can't say no?
So there are a lot of people commenting on my video to say that there are situations where you simply can't say no if you're really threatened with violence.
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely.
And of course that does happen. But there are gang rapes, there are terrible, terrible crimes committed in this world. But I probably need to follow up on this at some point in a future video, because this just wasn't the context of what I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about war-torn third world countries. And I also wasn't talking about gang rapes in India. And I wasn't talking about someone jumping out from behind a bush when you're walking home at night. This was abuse. Right. We weren't even really talking about rape.
Right.
The word rape has come up over and over again in women's testimonies, but they were mostly talking about abuse, something that either evolved very gradually over time, like Evan Rachel Wood, or that was there from the very first moment, like with Esme Bianco, or the girl who was the girl who he wanted to do a blood pact with her. The first thing he said to her was, "I'm gonna bite you."
Yeah, Gabriella. Yeah.
Blood pact and all that, and then despite all of that, she still chose to pursue a relationship.
Right. Right.
Those are the sorts of things we're talking about, and I just want to make it very clear that, of course, words are often not enough. You can't expect a woman to fight back in all situations. You can sometimes risk your life by fighting back. So I was not claiming in any way that rape can always be prevented.
No,
it's just heartbreaking, actually, that some people would misinterpret my words so willfully or just not listen. I mean, I don't know what it is. I guess most people just didn't listen beyond the first few minutes, but I just wanted to make that very clear.
Yeah, no, thank you for doing that. And like you said, there's so much room for misunderstanding, unfortunately, in this. And I do think that it's a hard one to discuss, that a lot of people, it's very personal. A lot of people get angry. You know, one of the things that you brought up there is how, you know, putting aside the violent rapes or threats of violence or those sorts of things, okay, and we're now talking about these murkier situations, which actually constitute most of the sexual assaults, for instance, on college campuses. Like when you hear the statistic that, you know, what is it, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted in college. You know, we can talk about this more later. Some of our viewers might already know this, but they are not, that statistic is not talking about what we would think of, what we just talked about as, you know, violence or physically coercive sex. And it's not rape, and it's not talking about just about people being passed out. It's also counting as sexual assault any unwanted attention or harassment from a man. So let's say that when you're in college, a guy comes up to you, you know, maybe drunk at a party and puts his arm around you and is, you know, being annoying, how people can be. Well, that would be counted in this survey as sexual assault. And what's interesting is that in this famous survey of college women, when they actually asked the women if they had been sexually assaulted, the number of women who answered yes was much less than 1/4 or 1/5, whatever it. But then they went back and they asked them these other things. Have you ever had sex because you had had too much to drink? Things like that. And so anyway, and so they recoded it as sexual assault. So my point being that there is this real gray area, and I think that one of the articles that I read about this pointed out that sometimes this label of sexual assault is being used to describe ungentlemanly behavior, and that in the past, with a more traditional society, think of 1950s America or whatever, in a more traditional society where women were encouraged to not lose their virginity and to be very protective of themselves and so forth, men were also encouraged to be gentlemanly, to behave in a gentlemanly fashion. And so what's happened since then is that, feminism and the Cultural Revolution, it came along with sort of the free sex and everything. But now we're in this situation where people are trying to women want more gentlemanly behavior from men, and they don't know how to say that. So I think that some of them are basically labeling it as a kind of assault. So verbal coercion and these other things that are not assault, and yet they're getting lumped in. So anyway, please tell me what you think about any of that.
And there's also this widespread demonization of male sexuality, which ties in with what you were just talking about. And it does sound like the pendulum has just swung the other way. Because what feminists like to say is that women's sexuality used to be greatly misunderstood and demonized through the centuries. And it's like they just want to go the other way now. So, for example, we can trace this all the way back to the suffragettes. They had one of these slogans that votes for women, chastity for men.
Wait, say that again?
Votes for women, chastity for men.
Votes for women, chastity for men. I've never heard that. Okay.
So that was actually a suffragette slogan 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. So it's really interesting because I used to kind of believe that feminism was once needed, but I've changed my mind about a lot of things. Women's liberation was definitely needed, but the liberation of all people from strict gender roles was needed. Helping everyone realize who they're meant to be and explore themselves and find the way of life that works for them. So it just sounds like basically that it took feminists 100 years to finally achieve that suffragette ideal, that man can now literally lose everything in his life just for saying the wrong thing, making the wrong comment, touching a woman inappropriately.
Right. And we're not endorsing ungentlemanly behavior, or we're not saying that it's fine if a guy touches a woman and she doesn't want it. But we're just saying that there's a whole spectrum of problematic sexual behavior, and not everything is a crime, and not everything is a cancelable offense. And also the thing about the thing about sexuality is, it is, as we know, it's a very basic animalistic thing. It is not civilized, if you just the Freudian id, or whatever word you want to use for it. And so, what we're trying to do, what civilization tries to do, is take something that's really wild and uncivilized, and even has something of a kind of a violence about it. Like, if you didn't know what sex was and you watched people doing it, you'd be like, what is he doing to her, or whatever, right? And my point being that we take that and then we try to control it and so forth. But I feel like it's almost like some modern feminists have sort of just are in denial about sexuality, or in a number of ways, obviously. But this idea of like affirmative consent, almost like you need a contract to move on to the next base.
That is ridiculous, this requirement that you're meant to ask for consent at every stage, literally before every single move. And it's always the man's responsibility to make sure the woman is okay. And there is something about sex, you pointed it out correctly, that it is animalistic. And by the nature of it, that's what it is. And feminists do have a hard time reconciling that with gender equality. Andrea Dworkin spoke about penetration, women being penetrated as a symbol of their oppression and things like that.
Like all sex is rape, basically, or all penetrative sex is rape, right? Something like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, she would, I think it was also her who said that the difference between rape and consensual sex is that in consensual sex, you get a bottle of wine or like something like that.
Oh, right. Yeah, man. Very provocative ideas.
So there is this very deep-seated frustration trying to pretend that civilized sex is possible. Or be respectful and gentle.
Right. And of course, if you see that, you then you worry that people are thinking that you're talking about rape, that you're saying, well, sex is animalistic, so people are just going to get raped. And of course, again, that's not what we're saying at all. But I'm sorry, please continue.
You're very good at making those little clarifications, by the way. That's probably why you don't get as much hate as I do under my videos, because I don't do that.
Well, I wanted to ask you, come back to this, but can you tell people in my audience who aren't familiar, how did you get involved in making this video about Marilyn Manson? You had kind of a nice weekend with him years ago when you were young and everything, but have you gotten a lot of hate, or what has the reaction been to it?
I would say it's about 60% positive, 40% negative. So it is more positive than negative, but I've got a lot of hate. I mean, I must have got over 1,000 comments just telling me that I'm victim blaming and I should be ashamed of myself and I should shut up and all that.
You know what? I mean, I get some of those remarks, but not as many. I think that
you're a lot more careful, as I said.
Well, I don't know, but what I'm curious, like, they just don't think that you should be sharing your experience with him, or they think that your calls for female responsibility, that's victim blaming. I guess
it's twofold. One part of it is that what they keep pointing at over and over again is that my experience doesn't discredit the experience of the other women. And I never said it did. So it stops there. And then the other part is that, yeah, but you can't always bite back. Different women have different lived experiences. If you were abused as a child, you might find it harder. You might freeze in a situation like that. And that's all true. That is completely true. But one thing, I just keep coming back to the Persephone archetype because I feel it explains a lot of things. And I actually show this academic paper in my video about cancel culture, this paper that came out late last year, that it's about a new personality type, which the psychologists call tendency for interpersonal victimhood. And what the paper is all about is that there is
a personality disorder, kind of, basically?
A type. They don't call it a disorder. Oh, okay. Personality type.
Okay.
This is something that's inherent. This research hasn't been going on for very long. They don't really comment on how it actually develops, but I think it's very well established in the psychology community that most personality traits are determined very early in life.
Yes.
Like at the age of 6, 7, 8. So what the psychologists argue is that there are people who have this tendency to always view themselves as victims. And this has a lot of implications for all interpersonal interactions. So this has nothing to do with the experience of an actual crime of any sort. Because there are women who have been through the most horrific experiences, who have been brutally raped. Like I have a friend who was raped as a child, and she would never define herself as a victim first and foremost. Obviously has affected her, she would not deny that, but she's not a victim. And on the other hand, there are women who have never had anything really bad happen to them, but they're still desperate to claim oppression and victimhood. So it is a personality type. And there's this trend of feminism that caters to this personality type thing. And it's more common in women, I think, because it's more socially acceptable.
Well, I was going to say it seems like a kind of a passive aggressive way of hurting someone. But this is interesting. You talk about how well, there's like a whole industry now, and I think Woody Allen. Maybe talk about him in a minute, but he, years ago, when he was dealing with these accusations way back, and he said that there's a whole industry basically that's sprung up around this stuff, and that's really the feeling that I get, like with the Marilyn Manson allegations, and we've talked about this, but the fact that they were all rolled out at the same time and it was coordinated and the statements even sounded the same and the stories and everything, and and the women are using them, some of them, to promote themselves. And anyway, yeah, it's and this focus on victimization, one of the problems that I have with it is I don't think that it is, and there's research behind this, but I don't think that it is good for your psyche, for one's psyche, to think of oneself as a victim. I'm not saying that if someone abuses you, you shouldn't deal with it, but the idea of therapy is that you work through things, not that your worst experience becomes your identity. And I don't think it is helpful in a number of these borderline of these cases that we talked about that really aren't rape or assault, but that are just bad behavior. I don't think that it is helpful to women to psychologically code that behavior as abuse. That's just me. Anyway, what do you think about that?
Well, the reason I really loved your analysis of the Esme Bianca interviews, because you picked up on all these weird little snippets, statements that just sound so strange and surreal. And it's actually quite common for women. I think it was a big deal in the 90s that some psychologists, some psychotherapists came up with this theory that they call it repressed memory syndrome, I think. There was this idea that women who were abused bury these memories deep in their unconscious, and they actually remember that until the therapist actively encourages her to rediscover that memory so that she can cope with it. And this could be the case. Trauma can have this impact, especially if the person was very young. Right. But in adulthood though, it is not very common to completely bury a memory into the unconscious.
No, so, I think it's almost been, the idea's almost been discredited, really. It was so popular in the 80s, right? In the 80s.
Apparently, there's still therapists, especially feminist therapists, who promote this idea. And that's exactly the vibe I got from Esme Bianco, maybe the others too, but she actually said at some point that it took her 7 years to realize that she was abused. Like she admits it that at the time, she did not see it as abuse. 7 years after she left, that's when she realized that she was abused and trafficked and all that. I'm really sorry. Real victims of human trafficking and all horrendous crimes have my full support and sympathy and empathy, but I think it's trivializing to the experiences of those actual survivors of these horrific crimes for someone to say that it took her 7 years to realize that she was trafficked.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And of course her version of trafficking is that he paid for her to come to LA, where she ended up getting great work, and he put her up in his mansion and everything. And I understand that she contends that he was torturing her during this time or whatever, but it's not trafficking, and it's not. And it seems like one of the problems and concerns I have with feminism is that modern feminism is that it seems like so many of these terms are being expanded until they don't mean anything or they anymore, you know. Just so like talking about rape and sexual assault, you know, these terms used to pack more of a punch in a way because people understood them as being these really extreme acts. Now when sexual assault and when even like minor sexual harassment is considered by to be assault, or trying to verbally coerce someone into sex, you know,
like we have undefined these terms, and
yeah.
that's. But do you think it will ever be possible to return to a more sensible definition to these things?
I mean, I'd like to think that history and politics are very cyclical, or it's like a pendulum. And so, you know, eventually people get tired of something or the excesses of something. And so then they want to swing back. I think, I don't know. I guess my big concern is that I think I talked about this in one of my videos. I think that we are in uncharted waters with the media, that we're this is like a huge new period in human history where we are this locked in with technology and social media and internet porn and all kinds of stuff. And I almost kind of think it's going to get worse, maybe because people are going to get more and more sort of hysterical, and they're going to be, and the media is so incentivized to cover this stuff. So I don't know. I would like to think one day down the road. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but maybe I'm too cynical. What do you think?
I mean, cancer culture is a relatively recent phenomenon.
Yeah.
I'm really hoping it will just run its course eventually and people will get desensitized. Like, I really don't know. I remember thinking about 8-10 years ago that it has become, as an artist, as a creative person, it has become quite difficult to shock people. That's how I felt 10 years ago. It's like everything has been done already.
Right.
What can you do to shock people again? And somehow, mysteriously, it has become possible again. It only took a few years. And now it takes very, very little to shock people. And in a way, it's a great time to be an artist because, again, it's so easy to push boundaries, and I love that sort of thing. You know, I like a bit of provocation, but
Well,
at the same time, it's dangerous too.
well, you know, it's interesting how in some ways having more, I don't like political labels, but having more sort of conservative opinions that's actually become counterculture. And it's funny that Johnny Rotten, the you know, one of the guys of the Sex Pistols, you know, he was a Trump supporter and he's a conservative now. So it's I don't know, it's interesting. Um, it's interesting what you're saying about the shock value too, because I would not have expected us to be back in a time where there is basically censorship or attempts to censor, and where there are things that, you know, you can't say. Anyway, I think that's a good point. That's an interesting point.
I don't want to go into this in much detail, but as an example, just saying that there are two sexes, two genders is enough to
Yeah.
freak people out.
Yes. No, absolutely.
What it took 10 years ago or in the 90s. I was very young in the 90s, but I think that was a good decade. At least growing up in Hungary, it just felt like a sane sort of era. People, men and women, were pretty much equal. Everyone had an understanding of equality, and I think it has been downhill since the 90s.
Yeah, it's, you know, and I don't know if that again has something to do with the technology, the fact that really it wasn't until the turn of the century that, you know, like I didn't have a cell phone until the late 90s. I didn't have an iPhone for years after that. The internet in the late 90s was still something that people really didn't use very much, and so forth. And so I don't know if some of this again has really been accelerated with technology, but it's interesting. Now, one of the things that I think we wanted to talk about a bit too, was academia, and in particular, because you have tell our audience again what your degrees are in. What did you study?
My undergraduate degree was in biological sciences, and my master's was in something called science, technology, and society, which is mostly social science, but it also had a bit of science policy, history of science, and philosophy, science communication, that sort of thing. So there was a huge contrast between the two degrees.
Well, and I'm curious, what was your experience? Because you and I have both been to graduate school. Mine was in the humanities, and yours in social sciences, and I can talk about my background in a bit. But I'm curious, like, what was your experience like in that program, and did you see some of the things that we're talking about in terms of resistance to inconvenient truths, things like that?
So when I was studying biology, it was pretty straightforward. I wasn't really interested in politics at the time because it just didn't matter. You know, you go into the lab, you take measurements, you look at cells, you develop an understanding of an objective reality in a way because you have numbers, you have data that you're looking at and you interpret.
Mm.
Then going from that environment to social sciences, it was very, very shocking. I was looking back, I was really naive at the time because I wanted to study the complex interactions between science and society and culture and science and all that. And I really like the idea of looking at the larger picture. And the degree, the description of the degree sounded really good, but I was there to learn. So I had this naive idea that people go to university to learn, to obtain new knowledge. And that's what studying biology was like. You know, you have textbooks, you learn about cell structure, anatomy, all that stuff. The social sciences, it was listening to each other's subjective views and thoughts and ideas and experiences. What people mean by theory in social science has nothing to do with what a theory in science is, for example.
Really?
And a recurring theme throughout my master's was that there's no such thing as fact. Like whenever someone would mention by accident the word fact, there would always be someone pointing at it. What is a fact?
Very postmodern.
Everything is relative and subjective. There's no such thing as a scientific fact.
Yes.
And that was quite shocking to hear. A fact is not a straightforward concept. So the social sciences have got, on a fundamental level, they've got some of these things right, or at least they are, it's justifiable that they're asking these questions. And skepticism, asking questions is always a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very important for a society to have some shared concepts and values. Shared fundamental values are probably more important than called strict facts.
Yes, yes. You know, I've been reading some articles lately about France and what's going on. I think you saw these articles, what's going on over there, where they've really had enough of our woke, you know, postmodern perspectives here in the university, where there's no higher truth or absolute truth, and people can't even weigh different claims, and instead it's just a lot of, you know, race and gender obsessiveness.
Yeah.
And anyway, but one of the and so their government actually is looking into this, and there have a number of people in academia over there are concerned about this. And of course, some people have pointed out that this actually had its roots in postmodernism that was coming out of France. But here's my point: is that without some appreciation for objective truth as a goal, it's really hard if we can't weigh differing perspectives and assert that one perspective is better than another, or one thing is true and something else isn't. Then we're really in a difficult situation. And it seems like that's what you're talking about, is that you went from biology, where there was an emphasis on the scientific method and fact and so forth, to then the social sciences, which, despite their pretensions to being a harder science, is very subjective and very political now, extremely political, right?
Yeah. So there's this study that was done a few years ago, but I think it has been replicated, that it's a very, very overwhelming percentage of social scientists in academia who describe themselves as Marxists or activists.
Mm-hmm.
That was very visible. But the most striking difference in the interpretation of the word theory. So theory in lay terms means something very different to what a scientific theory is. And I believe the social sciences are only really sciences because that's the name of that field, but they don't have much to do with it. They don't follow the scientific method whatsoever. There's no peer review, which is one of the fundamentals of the hard sciences. So when scientists talk about a theory, what they mean is that they've conducted experiments. Probably many, many different groups of scientists have conducted the same experiment, and they have managed to replicate the results again and again. If all the conditions are constant, then you should always obtain the same result over and over again. And once it has been confirmed over time, it becomes a theory. Now, a theory is not an absolute truth in the sense that scientists are open to the idea that one day there will be a better theory to explain the same phenomenon. But you will probably be building on that existing theory and improving that, perfecting that. So, for example, fundamentalist Christians like to point out that the theory of evolution is just that, just a theory. Mm-hmm. It is a theory scientifically because it has been confirmed so many times and there are so many real life examples. Mm-hmm. It's easy to demonstrate the validity of the theory, but the theory of evolution itself has evolved a lot since Darwin first came up with the idea of evolution. So he wasn't right about everything. He got the basic principles right. But scientists in the last 150 years have been improving and perfecting that theory. And one very, very significant difference in the thinking of scientists like physicists, for example, and social scientists, is that real scientists are constantly trying to disprove their own ideas.
Yes.
Hypotheses, because of the peer review that's in place to get published in a respectable journal. Your work has to be peer reviewed by lots of scientists who are not going to be nice to you. They will tear your work apart if it's not consistent or if it's not good science. So as a scientist, it's in your best interest to disprove your own ideas, to
get to it before they do
mistakes.
Right? Yeah.
If you don't spot your own mistakes, someone else will, and that will be embarrassing.
Right.
Constantly trying to account for all possible errors and mistakes. Whereas in the social sciences, it's the exact opposite. You have a preconceived idea, and then you go out to get data and evidence to prove the idea that you decided is the case.
Right.
There's no such thing as peer review.
Now, in social sciences, they have, I mean, they claim that they have peer review in that someone will write an article and then they'll send it off to a journal and some others will look at it. But you're basically, what I think I'm hearing you say is that it is not grounded in the social sciences. Their version of peer review is not grounded in rigorous scientific method and objective thinking like biology, right?
Yeah. So
agree. Yeah.
Very famous case involving James Lindsay and two other scientists who managed to get these
ridiculous papers.
They just came up with the most ridiculous ideas. But one of the papers was that allowing male dogs to urinate in public places demonstrates patriarchy.
Yeah. Things like I actually remember that.
And I think that journal introduced some form of peer review after that. So
Right.
it was cool.
And like you said, it's you know, like for instance, in the humanities, you would have a theory, and usually it wasn't even like a really original theory, because you're encouraged just in academia just like to bite off a little tiny piece of something or someone else's theory and just kind of do something a little bit different, like tweak it. And so, but anyway, you have a theory and then you come up with an argument to back that up. But the point is, like, I think that from what I've read, that the social sciences, they feel insecure about the fact that they're not considered a rigorous hard science, but well, in fact they're getting even more into a lot of this race and gender and class and, you know, fat acceptance stuff. That's a field or a subfield, fat acceptance. So it's interesting.
I wonder what it was like for you to study humanities. Was this something you noticed quite early on? Was there anything that seemed strange to you?
Yeah, well, my experience in some ways was similar to yours in that I thought that graduate school, that the university would be a place for really expansive, edgy, you know, cutting edge thinking, unorthodox ideas. I thought that the people that I was around would by and large be like almost like you think of artists in a way, like really, you know, open and edgy and accepting of all kinds of different views. And so, and I thought we would spend a lot of time getting to the truth. I thought that we would be spending our time getting into these deeper truths and like what can we learn from this text and everything. And in text, we did that some, but you know, and the other frustration that I had with graduate school was that you would take a class on something, and I think this even happens sometimes at the undergrad level, but you would sign up for a class on something like, say, you know, Shakespeare, and then oftentimes you would find out that that class had been designed around the professor's pet theories or whatever their particular, you know, interest in woke stuff like race or gender or what have you. And it was just, I felt like it was very in some ways limiting, even though I learned a lot, and I'm glad I had that period in my life to read and study and grow. But yeah, it was not what I expected. And what I also found to my disappointment was that in general, not all, but in general, a lot of the people were actually very narrow-minded in their own ways. I mean, I don't know. When I was in graduate school, I went to a big school, and I think there in the entire humanities department that I was in, there was only one person who was conservative, and everybody else was really progressive. And I'm not saying there has to be a perfect balance, but it's like the social sciences. Oh yes, well, and what I found is that academia it's left leaning or progressive everywhere, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, the only exception to that is a college, for instance, like a Hillsdale, like a type of college that prides itself on, or you know, a Bible university or something. But no, in general, it doesn't matter, because there's so much indoctrination, and maybe too left-leaning people are more attracted to academia now. I guess it's a lot of complicated reasons. Um, and so anyway, it's interesting. And so in your experience, like, did you run up, like, were you disillusioned, or when you first discovered this about academia?
I made some great friends. I still have one very close friend that I met in graduate school. So I don't have any regrets. Sometimes I think maybe I should have studied psychology instead, but I wouldn't really change anything. I don't really have any regrets in general because it was an eye-opening experience. I didn't obtain any actual objective knowledge about the world, but I have definitely learned about myself. And at the time, it was just very confusing. But about 2 years later, I discovered the work of Jordan Peterson, and that kind of helped me understand what exactly was going on. So I just really wish I'd been familiar with his work back then. But one thing I wanted to ask you though is when you were studying literature, right?
That's right.
So Did you ever explore the personal lives of those authors? Because I know this was before cancer culture, but were there any attempts to cancel people from the curriculum because they were problematic in some way?
Oh, that's a good question. And what I would say is no. Of course, this was a number of years ago, but no, I think that there's been an emphasis on diversity, and I think increasingly, like if a teacher has a syllabus that has nothing but white men on it, and that are mostly white men, that's seen nowadays could be seen as a problem. Um, but no, I wasn't aware of that. It's interesting because we did study the biographies of these writers a lot, and that was one of the things that I thought was valuable. And actually, the attitudes seem to be very forgiving. It's almost like people can be forgiving of people who are dead. And say, oh well, yeah, sure, John Lennon, beat his wives and girlfriends, and maybe even beat his child or whatever. But that was in the past, and it seems like today there's just not. I'm not saying we should forgive wife beating, but it seems like today there's almost the sense that we've all been like born again or born anew, and there's this like there's this sort of impossible standard, that we're never going to say anything wrong, and we're never going to mess up, and we're never going to offend anybody. And uh, I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting. So
There's a tendency these days to go further and further back and judge people who lived in the past by the
well,
standards.
that is true.
And so many people don't understand. It's a relatively recent phenomenon, but it actually terrifies me that so many people don't understand why that's wrong, why you shouldn't be judging people who lived 100 years ago by the standards of today. Those people acted according to the best of their knowledge,
As you would if you were in that situation, right? Yes.
as we are doing today. So I think you have to extend the basic courtesy to those people to at least approach their lives with a sense of understanding if you want future generations to have the same courtesy towards you. Because come on, do you think we are so perfect these days? I mean, surely we are doing some ridiculous things these
Oh
days.
yes.
Generations will be laughing at. There's just no way that people had been making mistakes, crazy, stupid mistakes for centuries and centuries. And now we all have it figured out. We are perfect.
And there are things that we're doing as a society that one day people, I think, are going to look back on almost like we look back on slavery. Like, I eat meat, and I've gone hunting before, so I'm not an animal rights extremist, but the systematic torture that is involved in factory farming, or whatever term you want to use, but the way that most of us get our food comes from these very barbaric, inhumane practices. And people on the left and the right have started talking about this. But it's very easy to see one day people looking back and saying, I can't believe that you had this system where you enslaved and tortured, animals in these conditions. And that's everybody, just nobody even cared. And to me, it's the same thing as what you're talking about here. And you mentioned something earlier in the conversation about patriarchy and how you think that this idea has been misunderstood, and the past is not nearly as patriarchal as people think. And I think that it's important for people to understand. I just finished reading a book by a philosopher named Ken Wilber, and anyway, one of the things that he does is he traces the evolution of humankind, and he talks about these different periods in our evolution. And one of the things that he brings up a lot is that for most of our history, human beings have been involved in a very dangerous and brutal fight for survival. It is only relatively recently in the modern, first world, in fact, that people are not consumed with basic survival by and large. And so we don't understand, we forget how in the past men would do certain types of work and take on certain roles that, biologically speaking, in a number of ways, it was just more suited for them. Things that require a lot of upper body strength, things that require perhaps more testosterone, more aggressiveness, or what have you. And women, because there is a sense in which biology is determinative, especially when you take away technology. And that doesn't mean that it was some horrible oppressive patriarchal system. It means that this is how things actually evolved to be beneficial at that time. And maybe now some of these patterns are not beneficial anymore with our modern society. But I'll tell you something just real quick. We had this power outage here, blackout, and our power was out for several days, and for us it got really cold. It got down like to 0 degrees, and we didn't have running water for a while. And it's interesting how in my relationship with my guy, he just very naturally, he was doing all of these sort of stereotypically male things of like, taking care of bringing stuff in or going out and getting stuff and lifting heavy things and whatever. And I'm in here like trying to sort of whip up some kind of a little meal or something. And it wasn't oppression. It's not patriarchy. It's that when the shit hit the fan and we're back in survival mode, these gender roles reassert themselves very naturally. And so I think that you're right. Certainly there have been periods in history that were problematic for women, and there have been oppressive, cultures and regimes. And I think that there's certain parts of the world today that have real big issues. But my point being that we can't look at this thing so simplistically. It is wrong to see history as just a narrative of women's oppression. Anyway, so what you have to say about that?
As a general rule, the fewer rights women have, the more responsibilities men have. And
that's great.
Despite what feminists want us to believe, most men are loving and caring beings. They love the women in their lives so much that they would die for them in the past. Yeah. They would die to defend those women. If a foreign tribe invaded, they would go to war and give their lives. And it was a requirement. There was just no question about it. There was a war. If you were a young man, you had to go. So it is really not as black and white as a lot of feminists wants us to believe. And I just like the way Jordan Peterson once put it, that men and women had both been terribly oppressed by nature.
Yes, that's right.
And they were working together. So we should not view history as a long story of women being oppressed by men. Men and women were working together, everyone doing their part. There was a